All right. So today, if it loads, we're going to be talking about macrostructure. Y'all already have done and used macrostructure throughout this semester, but we're really going to dive into it before you make your formal outline for this speech to really just help you understand what we're looking for. So macrostructure, for today, we're going to do a macrostructure breakdown. Then we're going to identify some parts of macrostructure in your draft. And if there's time left, we can use it as work time for your informative service speech. And we'll see what that looks like just if we have some time at the end. So what is macrostructure? So macrostructure refers to your big picture, right? Thus why it's called macro and not micro, right? Big picture. And it's the organization of your presentations. So specifically your content, hang on, let me pause for a second. Apologies. They're a little crazy right now. So macrostructure. This is the organization of your presentation. Your specific content, so the theme, your thesis statement, your argument, your claims, all of that will change, right? You're not going to give the same presentation every single time. But your structuring elements, how you structure your speech, that doesn't change. So your introduction, your body, your conclusion, and the transitions, that's going to stay the same every time. And having that consistency helps you stay organized, that you as the speaker stay organized and organize your speech. So basic structure, you start with your intro, you have your body, which is 2 to 5 main points. Organized, make sure those are organized to maximize listener retention. So that might be going through, showing a couple of videos, making sure you're engaging with them, but just organizing those so you have listener retention. Ending with your conclusion, and then in between each of those parts, making sure you have your transitions. So introduction. Again, y'all have seen this a couple of different times. I think we used it for your self-introduction speeches. And then we also used it for the positive calm speech when you were telling me about a conversation or an interaction you had with someone that was considered positive communication. So the attention getter. We've talked about this. That's something that immediately is going to catch your listeners' attention, right? And it's going to somehow be connected to the topic. So we've talked about starting it off with a joke, or maybe starting it off with a question, starting it off with a story. But somehow whatever you started off with is connected back to your main topic. I know at the beginning of the semester, we had a lot of questions about what that audience or listener relevance is. That's just your statement that explains why we should listen to the speech on this topic. What is it? What's it to us, right? Why do we care? And that's where that comes in. Your speaker credibility, you've had to have this statement in every assignment that you've done so far, but you're going to share any research or personal experience that you have that make you credible. So something that you say that so your listeners know, I'm qualified to teach or to train on this topic. So for an example, I don't ever say it in my speeches or in my lessons, but if you notice, every time I have this title page, I put my name and then I put my master's, right? I say MA. That's just my credibility. You could call that my speaker credibility statement, because I'm letting you know I am qualified to teach this class. All right. Your thesis statement. So this is the same as if you were writing a paper, but you're stating in one sentence the goal of your speech. So in this speech, we're going to learn whatever, like this is X, Y, and Z. And then you have to end with your preview. So your introduction ends with your preview. A lot of times this feels weird for speakers, mainly because like in English class, we're taught not to preview the whole thing. And we're taught not, like in oral comm, you don't necessarily, when you're giving like your brown bag speech or whatever, you don't necessarily preview what you're going to talk about. So a lot of times I've noticed this is the hardest part to get people to do is preview. But you're going to list in order your main points, and it is literally as simple as saying, today we're going to cover point 1, point 2, point 3. And then you transition. So your transition just lets your audience know and get prepared for your next section. So you don't want to be like, we're going to cover this, this, and this, and immediately jump into your first point. Your audience doesn't have time to transition. So they don't know that they're listening for this main point. So in order to help guide yourself, but also kind of guide your audience, you're going to have some sort of transition statement. So you can say, first, I'm going to tell you, I often use, if everyone is ready, we're going to hop into our next point, or we're going to hop into this, main point, something along those lines, though, so that you and your audience know, like, it's time to move on. So the body. Again, this is typically 2 to 5 main points. I usually stick around 3. 3 points are a good amount. It's not too much information for your audience members. Now, if you have a specific time limit you're trying to reach, like you have a certain time frame, if you need to add a couple of more points, by all means add them. But 3 is kind of a sweet spot. So your first main point, or it's super important that all of your main points are supporting your thesis statement. So you need to make sure that whatever those main points are, they're not just random and like off topic. You need them to be support for your thesis statement. So if you're saying, if my thesis statement, like if I was doing this informative service speech and my thesis statement was, this organization uses like the purpose of this is to analyze how the communication in this organization is positive communication, or how they use positive communication. I wouldn't then want to start talking about something totally random that's not about positive comm. So your first main point, make sure in each of these points you also have your listener relevance connection. So why that piece of information is important for your audience to know. And then in between each point, specifically the first and second points, and then after your third point, if you have more main points, you need to have a transition statement. So there needs to be a transition between every single main point. So you'll say, I've told you about first main point. Now let's talk about our second main point, which is ... And then you go into your second main point. And then you do the same thing for your second main point. After your last main point, you need to have a transition, but it needs to let your audience members know that you are concluding. So you'll say, in conclusion, you can end it that way. You can say, now that we've done, talked about these 3 main points, let's hop into our wrap up, or let's hop into our ending. However you want to word that. I try to stay super conversational, but it really just depends on how you are as a speaker. So your conclusion, this is super important. You need to basically repeat your introduction, but backwards, right? So you have your thesis restatement. So you're restating the main idea of your speech, which should match what you had in the introduction. Your main point summary. So you'll literally just say, in this speech, we covered this, this, and this. Again, in the order that you covered them. And then your clincher, is the closing of your speech, the thing that like wraps it up in a bow for your audience. And it needs to refer back to that attention getter. So if your attention getter was a story and you stopped midway through that story and be like, we'll come back to that. At the end of your presentation, you need to come back to that story and be like, I told you this story at the beginning, and I bet y'all want to know how it ends. And then you wrap it up. Or if you asked a question as your attention getter, you might want to answer that question, right? So there needs to be some sort of clincher, but it needs to refer back. A super important note that I forgot to put on here: you do not need to add any other information. Like there doesn't need to be new information here, right? So you don't need to be like, on a side note, and add something that should have been in one of your main points. So the conclusion is for strictly restating and not for adding new information. Visual aids, super important. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't use them well. It's kind of hard to tell because we're on Zoom and I have to share my screen, so the screen's really big. You're not supposed to read straight from your PowerPoints, right? So a lot of times in modern presentation, when visual aids are used, they're ineffective because you don't have the right things on them. So the father of modern advertising, his name is David, I hope I don't mess this up, but I probably will, David Ogilvy or something like that. He said most people use PowerPoint like a drunk uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. What that means is a lot of times I type a lot of words on here so y'all can take notes, but typically when I'm giving just a speech, like if I were training on something, or if I was just giving a PowerPoint, like a presentation, just to inform someone, and I wasn't expecting people to take notes, my visual aids, my PowerPoints, or whatever my visual aid are just bullet points that are important for the audience members to know, and maybe something that I can refer to, but it's not something that I'm reading off of. So this is super important because you have to have a visual aid for your presentation. So this service speech that's coming up, you must use a visual aid. So we're going to go over the 4 C's to have an effective visual aid. So that's clarity, creativity, consistency, and coordinating. Also, literally all of the information I've given you today so far, and what I'm going to finish giving you, all of this can be found on the syllabus and survival guide, like towards the bottom. So you have access to all of this. But clarity. So that's making sure there's a title slide that has your name, the title of the presentation, maybe a relevant image. Slides are simple and focused on one idea per slide. So for an example, if we were looking at this, this specific slide, I don't have all 4 C's on one side, I just have clarity. So I have one idea per slide. Each slide has an accurate title that reflects the content of the slide. The content is purposeful. The content's purposeful, it's necessary to the message and not merely novel. So that just means there's a reason for it. It's organized. If you're using text, don't use a bunch of words. And if text is used, no more than 6 lines. That's again, what's going on here? That's again for specifically your presentation. Obviously, if you're teaching, that looks a little different, so don't take my examples word for word, or like exact examples of what it should look like, because teaching is slightly different than training or just presenting. So creativity. you need to have relative images, whether that's a photo, a graph, a chart, whatever. It needs to be relevant to what you're talking about. Making sure there's color that's used effectively, with accessibility in mind. So making sure like white background, black text. You don't want to use clashing colors or colors where like you have to think about audience members might be colorblind. And so they can't see certain colors. And so maybe staying away from like the reds and greens and like colors that are commonly people commonly have a hard time seeing, especially if they're colorblind. And the visual aid shouldn't be distracting. So if you're using a transition, like you're using a little animation, make it simple. Don't make it like do this huge thing. Make sure a timer's not used. Again, this is for y'all's presentation. When you're teaching, sometimes a timer is really helpful. But your presentation should not have anything like that on it. Consistency. This is making sure that you've cited everything, your pictures and your sources. This is making sure you've got the same background on each slide. So choose a theme and stick with it. Making sure you're using the same bullet points and font size. Making sure the colors are the same, that's the same transitions. So you don't want to get crazy with it. Keep it simple. And then finally, coordinating. So advancing slides, you know how and when you're going to go to the next slide. Revealing or concealing. There are either blacked out slides in between slides, or you use the B on the keyboard to conceal slides. So if you need to move on from the slide you're on, but you're having, like, let's say you're having some sort of activity and you don't need anything on the screen for that activity, you need to have some sort of like blackout between the slide, your previous slide, and the one that you're going to go to. And then referencing, making sure each slide can be explained in relation to the content being presented. So just, again, making sure that correlation is there. All right, we're going to watch a couple of examples here. These are all speeches, and we just went over macrostructure. So we're going to watch some of these, and you're going to tell me, like, when we come back, you're going to come off mute, and you're going to say, like, I saw like an attention getter and a clincher, but we really missed transitions, or whatever. The visual aid wasn't great, or they kept referencing it too much, or whatever, everything we've talked about. So the first one is Jim's lunch speech. If you've watched The Office, you might have seen this. But I'm going to mute myself and we're going to watch this. And then we'll come back and talk. We skipped forward a little bit just so we're at the right spot, but the speech is about to begin. Okay, so thinking about some elements of macrostructure, what did we see that was there? And then what could they have brought in from macrostructure that what could they have included to make it more organized or more structured? So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen right now so that we can see each other as we're talking. And then I'll put myself on mute.
So I think the ultimate goal was to try to like sell their product, the little pyramid thing, but it ultimately just ended up being a bunch of like random points that didn't go together at all. He gave like stories about how like a time he cried at Disney World. None of that was really relevant. So I think just bringing in like relevant information and like structuring it could really help it out. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. What about visual aids? Did anyone notice the visual aids, and what were your thoughts?
Yeah, they also seem pretty random. It was just random pictures behind them the whole time. I don't even know what they were.
Right. So like some of them kind of seemed maybe relevant, like it was kind of triangle shaped thing. So like I noticed an airplane, or not an airplane, a spaceship. And so like if you just took the bottom part of it, it would be a triangle. But the fact that, a rocket ship is a lot longer, it didn't really work. They had like Martin Luther King Jr., I think, was one of the background. They had Abe Lincoln, that statue that's in Washington, D.C., like that. So yeah, they definitely did not follow those 4 C's. Anything else that anyone noticed about this speech that went well, or that they could have worked on? Okay, let's watch the next one. Let me go back to this. We're gonna watch the next one, and same thing. We'll watch it, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? A tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone, raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics. In 1930,
Hang on, let me pause that and stop sharing. So again, same thing, same question. What went well? What should he have brought in? Because even though we're talking about public speaking, some of you teaching something might come into play one day. And I use macrostructure all the time in the classroom. So what went well? And what could he have brought in to make it better?
He was seizing the information, which is good. That's like the only con, or the only pro. But like all the cons of it, it's monotone, it's boring. He's not giving people time to answer. He's just going, anyone, and then saying the answer. He should like bring in pictures or something, make it like at least a little bit more interesting than him just talking at the class.
Right. So if we look behind him, he had a chalkboard, like he had a chalkboard on like behind him, and he had all the information written up there. So technically he had a visual aid, but I'm sure it was just a lot of like data, or like fact driven things. So like a lot of dates or a lot of names, which can be really difficult when you don't present it in a fun way. It's really hard to get people to remember those. What else? What else? Let me hear from one more person before we move on. One more person, guys. And then we'll move on.
I guess the same thing what Max said. He didn't really give anybody a chance to answer the questions. He like moved on really quickly with the information. He would like ask them, "Oh, does anybody know this?" And nobody would answer, so then he'll just move on without, focusing a little more on it.
Right. And I would even say like his main points. So at one, we didn't hear a thesis statement in there. Like, what was the purpose of that topic? Like, what was the purpose of him talking? What was he trying to get across? What was his main goal? So aside from that part, which he might have said it before the clip started, right? We don't know that. But in the clip that we saw, we didn't hear that. And looking, okay, go get down. Looking at it, like assuming we did know, everything he was saying seemed really irrelevant and like not connected. He wasn't connecting those points, and there weren't transitions, right? I didn't hear any transitions of like, now that we've talked about this thing, we're gonna move on to this. So yeah, y'all picked out a lot of good things. Okay, this last one is a really good example. So it's kind of long, but it's worth it to hear all of these parts and kind of see how it works. So this is a TED Talk. A comedian, Hannah, I want to say like Gatsby or something is her name. She's an Australian comedian, and she gave a TED Talk, and it's brilliant. It has so many different aspects that we're looking for. So kind of jot down some notes, be prepared to come back and talk about like what you heard. And then we'll move on. Okay, I know that was a really long video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I think that was a really good TED Talk, and I really like Hannah Gadsby. But what were some things that you noticed? Were you able to pick out from macrostructure that we just talked about? What were some things you picked out?
Okay, so she definitely had an intro that was very good, and kind of kept on relating things back to her intro, but it seemed like her middle points were all kind of like randomized or not really in a direct order, but she kind of tied everything back into her main point, which kind of made it make sense. But her conclusion kind of brought it all together, I think, just by kind of describing like the things that she was trying to accomplish. But yeah, I think it was really good. I think it could have been a little bit like better structured, just because
Yeah.
some parts of it didn't really seem to go together. But other than that, I thought it was good.
I think where that's coming in is the fact that her points were contradictions, which she brought up at the beginning, right? She said, I'm I'm good at something I'm bad at. I quit something that launched my career. So I think a lot of that confusion came from she's explaining how these contradictions like played a role, or explained those contradictions. But yeah, I can see definitely where her main points were contradictions in and of themselves, which made it more difficult to understand. What else though? What else did we notice?
I thought it was really engaging because, all the contradictions and stuff, like she knows that she expects something and then boom, it's, something completely different. But everything, like Nicholas is saying, it still ties together.
Right. So she kind of she didn't have necessarily a punchline, but she did do that. She talked at the beginning about the 1-2 like the comedy, the 3 steps of comedy, where you make a statement, you list things off, and then you like surprise. That's, I think that's kind of how she approached it. So Anthony said in the chat, to bounce off what Nick said, I think her way of approaching her contradictions helped her connect with the audience a lot more. Yeah, so she definitely used those contradictions to kind of help the audience, guide the audience. I also noticed, and tell me what y'all think of this, I noticed a lot of questioning. So her asking or repeating the same question. How do you think she used those questions? I have an idea in mind, but I want to hear what y'all have to say. How do you think, or why do you think she was using those questions, and how do you think she was using them as part of that macro structure?
She was talking a lot about like connection and disconnection with their audience. So when she was asking those questions, I think, it was to consider, like put yourself in someone else's shoes. Like, have you ever been through that? Or which I could relate to what she was saying. So I don't know about everyone else.
Right. So I heard her questions as she would ask them and give us space to think about those questions. Not a ton of space where like it stopped her whole speech, but just like pause after that question and get us to think about it. And then she would go into answering those, which is a transition, right? That could be considered a transition. She would ask a question. And then she would transition. So she said, I'm sure by now you're probably wondering, what were my 3 points? Bam, transition into her conclusion, right? Where she's like, surprise, I didn't have any points, which wraps into her whole 3-step process of I state my idea, I list things off, and then surprise, right? That kind of wrapped it up into a nice little bow. Anything else that y'all want to bring up about that?
Just how she was mentioned at the end about her grandma saying like it's not the garden, it's the gardening, and like making that connection with your audience. I think she like implicitly stated what like her goal was, which I think that was kind of helpful.
Right. So restating her whole thesis, right? So her whole, like the main point of that is how can I be good at communicating when I'm terrible at communicating? And so like how can I build these connections? And then at the very end, she didn't restate it. She didn't take her original statement and restate it, but she did restate it. Like we knew that was her restating it. It was like, it's not about the garden, it's about the gardening, right? So yeah, definitely wrapping all of that up. So I hope y'all enjoyed that speech a little bit. I like Hannah Gadsby. She has a special on Netflix called Nanette, which she was kind of talking about. Kind of blew up in 2019 is when it was released, I think. So 2020, a lot of people started watching it because,
How long has he been in the bathroom?
Like
10 minutes?
The Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort
pause. There we go. All right, all the videos wanted to play again. So what we're going to do now is hopefully you have your rough draft. I did ask you to bring your rough draft of your outline with you. Now your outline should already be kind of formatted in Macrostructure, but I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. You should be able to share your screen and just like show your draft to your partner, and together identify some parts of macrostructure in your speech. So think about, do you have your attention getter and the clincher? Do they match? So do they go together? Are they cohesive? Do you have transitions between each part of your speech? So that means from intro to the body, between each main point of the body, and then between the last point and conclusion. Is your conclusion repeating your introduction, or did you include new information? And again, you should just be repeating. You don't need new information in your conclusion. Do your main points support your thesis? Do you have a thesis statement clearly stated and restated? Do you see any listener relevance there? So just kind of asking yourself these questions as you're going through and reading. This is a great time to like bounce ideas off of each other. So I'm gonna give you, we'll use this as work time as well. I'm gonna give you, I'm gonna say like 10 minutes, which puts us right towards the end of time. That should be enough rooms. So I'm just gonna put y'all in rooms with random people. And then y'all are going to go over your outlines and just see like, hey, what's going on? Do you see all of these important things? And then we'll come back and we'll wrap up with where we're at. I'm gonna give y'all 10 minutes. And I'm gonna go ahead and open the rooms.
Oh, you're perfect. I said, oh, you're perfect. It's okay. I don't mind.